Well, I was so fascinated as I got into Jeremy's book because the issues he's working on are things I've been working on for quite a number of years. And yet, in reading Jeremy's book, he goes into a depth and a nuance and a breadth beyond any book I've seen before. And I think it is a truly significant and distinctive contribution to our knowledge. Now, he started out with some important and kind of intriguing stories. But you put this in the largest perspective, which he does in the book. As I think everybody who is here knows, and he mentioned that I'm a member of the Club of Rome, and that's one of the discussions that's been going on for a long time about what we call our existential crisis and the potential suicide, self-destruction of the human species, and the potential that we could as well destroy Earth's capacity to support life even in the process of destroying ourselves. Now, that's kind of interesting because it positions us as the only species to our knowledge who's ever existed on this earth or any place with the ability to choose its own suicide, its own extinction. That's kind of interesting. What is it that makes us so different? And the theme that Jeremy really starts out with and carries through here is what's distinctive about being human? And he goes into the depth about, basically, it is our cognitive ability that distinguishes us from other species. And that cognitive ability gives us the capacity to construct realities in very different ways that then in turn shape our various cultures. Now, this is part of what I've explored in some of my books, particularly Change the Story, Change the Future. And it grows out of the distinctive experience. Well, it's actually not that distinctive, but the life experience that Fran and I shared through most of our adult professional years, living and working, deeply immersed in the cultures in Africa, Latin America, and then Asia. And I suspect that many of you have had a similar experience. How many of you have had a real in-depth cross-cultural experience, perhaps in the Peace Corps or any other? So this is something that's very distinctive about our particular generation. The first time that it has been a kind of common experience for many of us to immerse ourselves in a different culture. Now, what does this tell us? It exposes us to the extent that we can create different realities in our mind. Which is something that when you just grow up in a culture and you live your life in that culture, you're never aware of. That's just reality. So the stories that we come up with in our cultures and that we're introduced to and grow up with, that is the reality. And what Jeremy has done so much better than I have ever seen before is, first of all, the introduction of how did we kind of become conscious? How did that evolve? What was the role of language? How did language develop? And then how did that ultimately shape the way we think in terms of our cognitive abilities? And then how did that play out in other great civilizations over time? And how did those civilizations interact, leading to our current situation where our cognitive structures leave us in threat of self-extinction? And he plays this through in a greater depth and much more effectively than I've ever seen in a book. And the kind of two dominant themes is that in our Western culture, we have separated the cognitive and the physical and the material, the dualism. So, you know, our cognitive exists somewhere over here and the physical exists somewhere over here. It's really pretty weird when you think about it, but the way Jeremy presents it, we can see that in our culture and the ideas that we have been trained in and grew up with. And I think one of Jeremy's advantages is he doesn't have a PhD, and I don't think you've ever taught on a college campus anywhere. So he hasn't been disabled intellectually by that experience. He also still has the ability to write clearly, which is a very special talent. So anyhow, there is this characteristic of this split. And then once we got it split off, we can really go crazy in our cognitions. And where this connects directly to my work on, you know, when corporations rule the world and the Great Turning and so forth, is that in our contemporary culture and our economies, we have gotten into where money has become our defining value. And this is totally fascinating in a way. You know, we measure our progress by how much money we make. And yet, as we all know, I mean, this is somehow is very esoteric, but it's not. I mean, we all know that money is nothing but a number. It's created out of nothing. And yet we have a whole cognitive frame that tells us if we are destroying Earth's capacity to support life, and the money numbers are going up, that somehow we're getting richer and better off. And we have a whole discipline of economics that's totally devoted to developing this fundamental fallacy. Now, there's another fallacy that Jeremy develops so beautifully. Mechanism. And we're beginning to pull out of this in science now on the frontier. But still, the cognitive foundation of our science is mechanism. And the whole idea that life is mechanism and life is a machine. It gives us the whole field of medicine, which you know, the pills and knives. You know, in contrast to homeopathic medicine, which is about how does life heal. And so what on the frontiers of our thinking we're beginning to get into is a recognition. Could you imagine? We humans are living beings. Imagine that. And we are born of and nurtured by a living earth. And then if you begin to get into that, you get into the depth of the incredible complexity of life, just beginning with each of our living bodies and the tens of trillions of cells that are now organizing in our bodies every minute, every second to create the crucible of our consciousness. How do they do that? Anyhow, you begin to extend that into our living systems of Earth and so forth, and you can begin to see how far out of touch we are in our cognitive framing around which we organize now as a global species. And these frames have come in and begin to permeate and overwhelm other cultures, including those cultures that actually have a much deeper understanding of the nature of our reality. And I'm going to want you to talk a little bit about some of that. So anyhow, that's what the book is about. It's what the conversation's about. In terms of my books, this is specifically about the economy and corporate rule and the financial systems. The original book was 1995, but it's now, that's the 2015 20th anniversary edition. Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community is a piece of the history that Jeremy goes with, and Change the Story, Change the Future, in contrast to his very long and very deep book. I think now it's almost kind of a simplistic statement of how our our cognitive frame shape our civilization, current civilization. So I strongly recommend all of you reading Jeremy's book. So